Welcome to Dark Night. I'm here with you tonight, ready to share some eerie tales while you drift into peaceful sleep. Tonight you'll hear 3 unsettling stories as the gentle rain falls outside your window. The black screen will keep your mind calm and your eyes rested, while these dark tales unfold in the shadows. Before we begin our journey together, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Dark Night for more haunting bedtime stories. Now, settle into your blankets, close your eyes, and let yourself relax completely as we venture into the unknown together. Story 1. The Midnight Frequency. This happened to me 3 years ago when I was working the overnight shift at a small radio station in rural Montana. KLTW was one of those tiny stations that barely reached beyond the county lines, playing classic rock and local news to farmers and insomniacs. I'd taken the job because I needed the money and didn't mind the solitude. Most nights I'd just sit in that cramped booth, watching the equipment meters dance and occasionally taking calls from lonely truckers or people who couldn't sleep. The station was housed in an old brick building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by wheat fields that stretched endlessly in every direction. During the day you could see for miles, but at night, especially on cloudy nights like the one I'm about to tell you about, the darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond the parking lot lights. It was a Tuesday in late October when things started getting strange. I'd been on the job for about 6 months by then, and had settled into a comfortable routine. Around midnight I'd usually get a call or two from regulars. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who suffered from insomnia, or Jake, a trucker who drove the interstate and liked having someone to talk to during those long, empty stretches of highway. But that Tuesday night the calls were different. The first one came at exactly 12:03 a.m. I answered with my usual greeting. KLTW, you're on with Danny, what's on your mind tonight? Silence. Not dead air, but the kind of silence that feels alive somehow. I could hear breathing, slow and deliberate, and underneath it something that sounded like static. Not radio static, but something organic, like wind through dry leaves. Hello? I tried again. Anyone there? The breathing continued for another 10 seconds, then the line went dead. I shrugged it off. Prank calls weren't uncommon, especially during the overnight hours when bored teenagers might think it was funny to mess with the radio DJ. 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same area code, different number. KLTW, this is Danny. This time there was a voice. Faint, like it was coming from very far away, but definitely human. A woman's voice, though I couldn't tell her age. I can hear you, she whispered. Great, that's what we're here for, I said, trying to inject some humor into the situation. What would you like to hear tonight? I can hear you when you're not talking. That stopped me cold. I'm sorry, what do you mean? But the line was already dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment, trying to process what she'd said. When you're not talking. What did that mean? When I wasn't on the air? When I wasn't speaking into the microphone? It didn't make sense. I tried to push it out of my mind and focus on my show. I had a playlist to get through, station IDs to read, weather updates to deliver, but I found myself glancing at the phone more frequently, and I started paying closer attention to the background noise in the booth. The old building had its share of creaks and groans, sounds I'd grown accustomed to over the months, but tonight they seemed different, more deliberate. The third call came at 1:47 a.m. Different number again, same area code, KLTW. The frequency is wrong. It was the same woman's voice, but clearer now, as if she was getting closer to whatever phone she was using. Ma'am, if you're having trouble with our signal, you might want to adjust your, not that frequency, the other one. The one underneath, my blood went cold. Underneath what? You know what I mean. You can hear it too, can't you? In the spaces between your words. In the silence between the songs. I looked at my equipment, all those familiar dials and meters and LED displays. Everything looked normal. The transmitter was operating at the correct frequency, 104.7 FM. Our signal was clean. No interference showing on any of the monitors, ma'am. I think you might have the wrong... Listen, she whispered. And then the line went quiet, but not dead. I could hear her breathing, and underneath it, that strange static sound I'd noticed in the first call. But now I realized it wasn't static at all. It was voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all whispering at once. Too quiet and overlapping to make out individual words. But definitely human voices. I hung up the phone. The rest of my shift passed without any more calls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The booth had one small window that looked out over the parking lot and the fields beyond. And I found myself staring out into that darkness, looking for, what movement? Lights I didn't know. At 6 a.m. my replacement Dave showed up, and I'd never been happier to see another person. I didn't mention the strange calls. How do you explain something like that without sounding crazy? But the calls continued. Every night I worked, between midnight and 2 a.m. I'd get at least 3 or 4 calls from different numbers, all in the same area code, all from that same woman. She never gave me her name, and when I tried to ask, she'd just hang up. But her messages were always variations on the same theme. There was something wrong with the frequency. Something broadcasting underneath our regular signal. I started paying closer attention to our equipment during those hours. I'd watch the meters, listen through headphones for any anomalies in our broadcast. I even started recording the audio to analyze later, but everything looked and sounded normal. We were broadcasting at exactly the frequency we were supposed to, with no interference, no secondary signals, nothing unusual at all. After 2 weeks of this, I decided to do some research. I looked up our station's history, thinking maybe there had been some kind of incident in the past, something that might explain these calls. What I found was interesting. KLTW had been broadcasting since 1962, but it hadn't always been a music station. From 1962 to 1978, it had been a community emergency station, part of the old emergency broadcast system. During the Cold War, stations like ours were designated to continue broadcasting in case of national emergency, including nuclear attack. They'd installed special equipment, backup power systems, underground cables, the whole works. But here's the strange part. According to the records I found, our frequency, 104.7 FM, had never been used for regular broadcasting before 1979. It had been reserved exclusively for emergency communications. And in 1978, something had happened. The records were vague, but there had been some kind of technical malfunction that had shut down the emergency system permanently. Whatever equipment they'd installed for emergency broadcasting was supposedly disconnected and removed. I started looking more carefully around the station building. In the basement, behind the main electrical panel, I found a door I'd never noticed before. It was painted the same color as the wall and had no handle, just a small keyhole. I'd asked Dave about it once, and he'd said it was probably just old storage, nothing important. But now I was curious. I found a screwdriver and managed to pop the lock. Behind the door was a narrow staircase leading down into what looked like a sub-basement. The air was stale and cold, and my footsteps echoed in the confined space. At the bottom of the stairs I found a room that wasn't on any of the building's floor plans I'd seen. The room was filled with old broadcasting equipment, much more sophisticated than what we had upstairs. Banks of receivers, transmitters, recording devices, all connected by thick cables that disappeared into holes drilled through the concrete walls. Most of it looked like it hadn't been used in decades, but when I looked closer, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Some of the equipment was still running. Green lights blinked on several of the receivers. Tape reels turned slowly on an old recording system, and on one of the frequency monitors I could see our station's signal, 104.7 FM, along with something else. A secondary signal, much weaker, broadcasting on the same frequency but slightly out of phase. It was almost invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. I found a pair of old headphones and plugged them into the monitoring system. For a few seconds I heard our normal broadcast, a classic rock song that I'd put on rotation before coming downstairs. But then I adjusted the phase control and underneath our signal I heard something else. Voices. Hundreds of them, all talking at once. Some sounded close, others distant and hollow. I couldn't make out most of what they were saying, but occasionally a word or phrase would come through clearly. Can anyone hear me? Is anybody there? Please respond. This is an emergency. I listened for what felt like hours, adjusting the controls, trying to isolate individual voices. And then I heard something that made my blood freeze, my own voice, clear as day, saying, "KLTW, you're on with Danny, what's on your mind tonight?" But I was in the basement. I wasn't on the air. That recording had to be from earlier in the night, or maybe from previous nights. Someone or something was capturing and rebroadcasting pieces of our regular programming, mixing them in with all those other voices. And then I heard her, the woman who'd been calling. Her voice came through the headphones as clearly as if she were standing next to me. "He's listening now. He can hear us. Tell him about the others." I ripped the headphones off and backed away from the equipment, but I could still hear the voices, faint but audible, coming from speakers I couldn't see, and they were all talking about me now, describing what I was wearing, where I was standing, what I was doing. He found the room. He's scared now. Tell him about the night it happened. Tell him what we've been waiting for. I ran. I don't remember climbing the stairs or locking the door behind me. But somehow I found myself back in the broadcast booth, shaking and trying to catch my breath. The regular programming was still running, but now I could hear it. That underlying frequency, those whispered voices, hiding just beneath our normal signal. I looked at the phone, and as I watched it started ringing. I didn't want to answer it, but something compelled me to pick up the receiver. Danny. It was her voice, but this time it sounded like it was coming from inside the building. "We've been waiting so long for someone to find us. We've been trying to call for help since 1978. Who are you? What happened in 1978? There was an accident. A test of the emergency system. They were trying to boost the signal, to make sure it could reach everyone in case something terrible happened. But they used too much power. The frequency overloaded. It trapped us." "Trapped you where?" "In the signal, Danny. In the space between the carrier wave and the audio. We're all here, everyone who was broadcasting that night. Everyone who was listening. We've been trying to get out, but we can only reach through during the overnight hours, when the regular programming is minimal and there's room for us to slip through." I could hear them now, even without the headphones. Dozens of voices all around me, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the equipment itself. "What do you want from me?" "Help us, Danny. You found the room. You know about the equipment. You can boost our signal. Make it strong enough for us to break free. Just for a few minutes. Just long enough to get out." I thought about what she was asking. If these people had really been trapped in some kind of electromagnetic prison for over 40 years, didn't I have an obligation to help them? But something about the situation felt wrong. The way they all seemed to know exactly what I was thinking, what I was doing. The way they'd been able to call the phone upstairs from down in that room. "If I help you," I said slowly, "what happens to me?" Silence. Even the whispered voices went quiet. "Danny." The woman's voice came again, but now it sounded different. Hungry. "Don't you want to be part of something larger than yourself? Don't you want to join us?" That's when I understood. This wasn't a rescue. This was recruitment. I slammed the phone down and started shutting down the broadcast equipment. But as I reached for the transmitter controls, every phone in the building started ringing at once. The booth phone, the emergency phone, the phone in the front office. All of them creating a cacophony of electronic screaming. And underneath it all, I could hear them laughing. The laughter followed me as I grabbed my keys and ran for the parking lot. It echoed from the radio in my car as I drove away, changing stations constantly but never able to escape it completely. It was in every frequency, every signal waiting. I never went back to KLTW. I called Dave the next morning and told him I was quitting, that there had been a family emergency. I moved to a different state within the week, but sometimes late at night when I can't sleep I'll scan through the radio frequencies. And sometimes just for a second I'll hear her voice calling my name, asking me to come back and finish what we started, asking me to help them reach more people, to spread their signal to other stations, other frequencies, and the terrifying thing is, part of me wants to. Part of me remembers how it felt to be connected to all those voices, to be part of something vast and eternal and hungry. I've never touched a radio after midnight again. If you're listening now, where are you from? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know who's sharing this darkness with me tonight. Now, let's slip into our next tale. A story. 2-2. The House on Elmwood Drive. I used to work for a property management company that specialized in rental houses around college towns. Most of the time it was routine stuff. Fixing leaky faucets, dealing with noise complaints, collecting rent from students who'd rather spend their money on pizza and beer. But every once in a while we'd get a property that was different. The house on Elmwood Drive was one of those. It was a beautiful Victorian, built sometime in the 1890s with all the classic features you'd expect. Bay windows, wraparound porch, intricate woodwork, high ceilings. From the outside it looked like something from a postcard, the kind of place that should have had a waiting list of people wanting to rent it, but it didn't. In the 3 years I worked for the company, that house sat empty more often than it was occupied. Tenants would sign a lease, move in with high hopes, and then leave. Sometimes after a few months, sometimes after just a few weeks. They always had reasonable excuses. Job relocations, family emergencies, better opportunities elsewhere. But there was always something in their eyes when they handed over the keys. Something that suggested their reasons weren't entirely honest. My boss, Margaret, had owned the property for nearly 15 years, and she'd started to think it might be cursed. She'd joke about it, but I could tell she was half serious. The house had beautiful hardwood floors, updated kitchen, plenty of space, and the rent was reasonable for the area. There was no logical reason why it should be so hard to keep tenants. That's why she asked me to spend a week there in late September. Someone had reported seeing lights in the windows at night, and she was worried about squatters or break-ins. She wanted me to stay there, keep an eye on the place, and maybe figure out what was causing all the turnover. I'll admit I was curious. I'd been inside the house dozens of times for repairs and inspections, and while it was old and had its quirks, I'd never noticed anything particularly unsettling about it. Sure, the floorboards creaked and the windows rattled when the wind blew, but that was normal for a house that age. I moved in on a Sunday afternoon, bringing just enough stuff for a week. Clothes, laptops, some groceries, and an air mattress since the house was unfurnished. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was inside. Even with the windows open, the sounds from outside seemed muffled, distant. It was like the house absorbed sound somehow. The first few days were completely normal. I worked during the day, came back to the house in the evening, watched Netflix on my laptop, and slept soundly on my air mattress in the master bedroom. If there was anything supernatural about the place, it was keeping itself well hidden. But on Thursday night, things started to change. I was in the kitchen around 9 p.m., making myself a sandwich when I heard footsteps upstairs. Not loud, not dramatic, just the soft sound of someone walking across the floor in what I knew was the front bedroom. My first thought was that someone had broken in, maybe through one of the upstairs windows. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly made my way up the stairs. The front bedroom was empty. I checked all the other rooms on the second floor, looked in closets, under the built-in window seats, anywhere someone might hide. Nothing. I checked all the windows. Still locked from the inside. I went back downstairs and double-checked the doors. Everything was secure. I convinced myself it was just the old house settling. Maybe some temperature changes causing the wood to expand and contract. Old houses made all kinds of noises, but the footsteps came again the next night. Same time around 9 p.m., same pattern. Slow, deliberate steps across the front bedroom. This time I was ready. I grabbed my phone and started recording as I crept up the stairs. If there was someone in the house, I wanted evidence. If it was just house sounds, maybe the recording would help me figure out what was causing it. I pushed open the bedroom door slowly, phone camera rolling, flashlight in my other hand. The room was empty just like before. But as I stood there in the doorway, I heard something that made my skin crawl. A voice, quiet like someone whispering but clear enough to understand. He's here again. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from right beside me, like someone was standing just over my shoulder. I checked the recording later, but the audio only picked up my own breathing and the sound of my footsteps. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind through the eaves had me on edge. I found myself lying there in the dark, listening for voices, for footsteps, for any sign that I wasn't alone. Saturday was my last night in the house, and I was counting the hours until I could leave. I decided not to tell Margaret about the voices. What could I say that wouldn't sound crazy? I'd write up a report about the security of the property, mention that I hadn't found any signs of break-ins, and leave it at that. But Saturday night, the house had other plans. I was packing up my things around 8 p.m. when I heard the front door open and close. Not violently, not like someone was breaking in, but casually, like someone who lived there was coming home. I heard footsteps in the front hallway, slow and measured, moving toward the stairs. I grabbed a baseball bat I'd brought from my apartment and called out, "Hello? Who's there?" "This is private property." The footsteps stopped. The house went completely silent, more silent than I'd ever heard it. No settling sounds, no wind outside, nothing. It was like the entire world had been put on pause. Then I heard my name. Michael. The voice was coming from upstairs now, from the front bedroom. A woman's voice, middle-aged, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Michael, could you come up here, please?" Nobody should have known my name. Margaret was the only one who knew I was staying at the house, and this definitely wasn't Margaret's voice. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" "Please, Michael. I need to show you something. In the front bedroom, every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to grab my stuff and get out of that house as fast as I could. But something about the voice, it didn't sound threatening. It sounded sad, almost desperate. Against my better judgment, I started up the stairs, bat in hand, moving as quietly as I could. The front bedroom door was closed. I was sure I'd left it open when I checked the room earlier. I reached for the handle, and that's when I noticed something that stopped me cold. There was light coming from under the door. Not electric light, but something softer, warmer, like candlelight or firelight. I could see it dancing and flickering across my feet. "Michael?" The voice came again from inside the room. "I'm waiting for you." I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was furnished now, not with modern furniture, but with pieces that looked like they belonged in the 1920s or 1930s. A brass bed with an intricate headboard, a vanity table with an oval mirror, a rocking chair by the window, and sitting at the vanity, brushing her long dark hair, was a woman in a white nightgown. I could see her reflection in the mirror, but when I looked directly at where she should have been sitting, there was nothing there. Just an empty chair and a hairbrush moving through the air, stroking invisible hair. "You can see me," she said, and her reflection in the mirror smiled at me. "Most people can't anymore. They feel me, they hear me sometimes, but they can't see me. That's why they leave." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I stood there in the doorway, watching this impossible scene, trying to make sense of what I was experiencing. "My name is Eleanor," she continued, setting down the hairbrush and turning to face me in the mirror. "I lived here with my husband James from 1923 until the accident." "What accident?" "The fire. It started in the kitchen and spread so quickly. James tried to get me out, but I was upstairs getting dressed for dinner. By the time I realized what was happening, the stairway was blocked. He called to me from outside, told me to jump from the window, but I was so scared. I waited too long. I looked around the room. There were no burn marks, no signs of fire damage. But as I watched, the furniture began to look different. The brass bed was tarnished and twisted. The wallpaper was peeling and smoke-stained. The floorboards were warped and blackened. "The house was rebuilt," Eleanor said, as if reading my thoughts. "They salvaged what they could, replaced the rest. But I stayed. I've always been here." "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I'm lonely, Michael. For 90 years I've been alone in this house. People move in and I try to be quiet, try not to disturb them, but I can't help myself sometimes. I get so excited to have company again. I walk around at night, I talk to them. I try to make them feel welcome, but they always leave." The room began to shift again, the burned furniture fading back to its pristine 1920s appearance. Eleanor's reflection looked at me with such sadness that I felt my heart breaking for her. "I don't want to be alone anymore. Could you stay? Just for a while longer?" I wanted to help her. Despite the impossibility of the situation, despite every rational thought in my head telling me to run, I felt genuinely sorry for this woman who'd been trapped in this house for nearly a century. But then I noticed something that changed everything. Behind Eleanor in the mirror, standing in the corner of the room, was another figure, a man in a charred suit, his face partially burned away, staring at me with hollow eyes. "Eleanor," I said slowly. "Is James here too?" Her expression changed. The sadness was replaced by something else, something possessive and hungry. "James doesn't like visitors," she said. "He gets jealous. He thinks they're going to take me away from him. But you're different, Michael. You can see us. You can talk to us. You could stay with us forever." The figure in the corner began to move closer to the mirror. As he did, I could see more of his burns, the way his skin was charred and peeling. the way his eyes reflected the phantom firelight. "We could be a family," Eleanor continued. "The three of us here in our beautiful house. You'd never have to worry about anything again. Never have to leave. Never have to be alone." James was right behind her now in the mirror, his burned hands reaching toward my reflection. And that's when I realized that while I could see them in the mirror, I could also feel cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing behind me. When I looked back at the mirror, Eleanor was standing now, and James was smiling with what was left of his mouth. "Don't leave us, Michael," Eleanor pleaded. "Everyone always leaves us." "I have to go," I said, backing toward the door. "I'm sorry, but I can't stay." "Yes, you can," James spoke for the first time, his voice like gravel and smoke. "It's very easy to stay. We'll show you." The door slammed shut behind me. I grabbed the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. The room began to fill with smoke, and I could hear the sound of crackling flames somewhere below us. "Don't fight it," Eleanor said. "It only hurts for a moment." The smoke was getting thicker, and the temperature in the room was rising. I could feel sweat running down my face, and my eyes were beginning to burn. But the door was still locked, and the windows were too high to jump from safely. That's when I remembered something my grandmother used to tell me about dealing with spirits. They can only keep you if you let them. If you truly, completely refuse to stay, they have no power over you. "No," I said firmly, looking directly at Eleanor's reflection. "I will not stay. I will not die in this house. You cannot keep me here." For a moment, nothing happened. Eleanor looked confused, hurt. James looked angry, his burned face twisting into a snarl. "Let me leave," I continued. "Let me walk out of this house, and I promise I'll make sure no one else gets hurt. I'll convince Margaret to sell the property, to tear the house down if necessary. I'll help you find peace, but I will not stay here." The smoke began to clear. The phantom furniture started to fade. Eleanor's reflection grew dimmer. "You promise?" she whispered. "You promise you'll help us find peace?" "I promise." The door clicked open behind me. I turned and ran, grabbing my bag from the master bedroom and racing down the stairs. As I reached the front door, I heard Eleanor call out one last time. "Thank you, Michael. Thank you for seeing us. I kept my promise. I told Margaret everything, and to my surprise, she believed me. She'd suspected something supernatural about the house for years. We contacted a local paranormal research group, and they confirmed what I'd experienced. The house had a history of unexplained phenomena going back decades. Margaret decided to donate the property to the Historical Society, with the understanding that it would eventually be demolished. But before they tore it down, the research group conducted a full investigation. They found records of the 1933 fire that had killed Eleanor and James Morrison, and they held a ceremony to help the couple move on. I don't know if it worked. I never went back to see. But I heard through Margaret that the lights stopped appearing in the windows after that, and the demolition crew reported no unusual activity when they finally tore the house down 6 months later. Sometimes I wonder if Eleanor and James found the peace they were looking for, or if they're still out there somewhere, looking for a new house to haunt, still hoping to find someone who won't leave them alone in the dark. Story 3. The Memory Garden. I'm a trauma counselor, and I've heard countless stories of pain and loss over my 15-year career. People come to me carrying burdens they can barely describe, wounds that go so deep they've forgotten what it feels like to not hurt. But in all my years of practice, nothing prepared me for what I encountered at Willowbrook Manor. Willowbrook was a private psychiatric facility built in the 1940s. Designed as a progressive treatment center for patients with severe mental illness. By the time I arrived there in 2019, It had been closed for over 20 years, but the state was converting it into a transitional housing facility for people recovering from addiction and homelessness. They needed someone to assess the psychological readiness of the space, to make sure it wouldn't trigger negative associations for vulnerable residents. It seemed like straightforward work. I'd done similar assessments at other former institutions. You walk through the spaces, note anything that might feel institutional or oppressive, suggest modifications to make the environment more welcoming and therapeutic. The pay was good, and I thought it would be a nice change from my regular practice. The manor sat on 47 acres of rolling hills about an hour outside the city. It was a beautiful Gothic revival building, all limestone and tall windows, surrounded by what had once been carefully maintained gardens. Even abandoned, it had a certain dignity to it, though 20 years of neglect had left the grounds overgrown and wild. I spent my first day doing a general walkthrough with the project coordinator, Janet, a cheerful woman in her 50s who seemed genuinely excited about the renovation project. She showed me through the main building, the former reception areas, the dining halls, the patient rooms that would be converted into apartments. Everything seemed normal if a bit dated and dusty. The only area we're not planning to use is the East Wing, Janet explained as we finished the main tour. It was the long-term care unit for patients who weren't expected to recover. The state has decided it's too expensive to renovate, so we're just going to seal it off. Can I see it anyway? I asked, just to be thorough in my report. Janet hesitated. The contractors won't even go in there anymore. They say it gives them the creeps, probably just because it's been closed up longer than the rest of the building. She led me down a long corridor that ended at a set of heavy wooden doors. The brass nameplate read, "Garden Wing, established 1952. Janet produced a large key and unlocked the doors, which opened with a groan that echoed down the empty hallway. The air inside was different, not just stale but somehow heavier, thicker, and there was a smell. Not decay exactly, but something organic and sweet, like flowers that had been left too long in water. "We'll make this quick," Janet said, clearly uncomfortable. "Just a basic walkthrough so you can note it in your report." The garden wing was laid out differently from the rest of the building. Instead of the institutional corridors I'd seen elsewhere, this wing was designed around a central courtyard garden. Patient rooms lined the perimeter, each with large windows facing inward so residents could see the garden from their beds. But the garden was wrong. Even through the grimy windows I could see that while the rest of the manor's grounds had gone wild with neglect, the courtyard garden was perfectly maintained. Roses bloomed in neat rows, hedges were precisely trimmed, and pathways were swept clean of leaves. "Who's maintaining the garden?" I asked. Janet frowned. "No one. The building's been sealed since 1999. There shouldn't be anyone with access." We moved through the patient rooms and I began to understand why the contractors had been unsettled. Each room still contained its original furniture. Hospital beds with restraint straps, small wooden chairs, personal belongings that had been left behind when the wing was closed. But more disturbing were the walls. Every room was covered in writing, not graffiti from vandals, but careful, methodical handwriting, covering every available surface. Names, dates, fragments of sentences, all written in what looked like pencil or charcoal. Some of the writing was so faded it was barely visible, while other sections looked fresh as if they'd been written recently. In room 12, I found writing I could actually read clearly. Margaret Thornton, admitted June 15, 1954, diagnosis, melancholia following childbirth. Thomas Chen, admitted September 3, 1961, diagnosis catatonic schizophrenia. Sarah Williams, admitted December 20th, 1948. Diagnosis: hysteria. Each entry included details about the patient's treatment, their daily routines, their fears and hopes. It was like someone had created a comprehensive memorial to every person who had lived in this wing. "This is incredible," I said, photographing some of the walls. "It's like a historical record of everyone who was treated here." Janet was reading over my shoulder and I noticed she'd gone pale. "Dr. Peterson, look at the dates on some of these entries." I looked closer and felt my own blood run cold. Mixed in with entries from the 1950s and 60s were others with much more recent dates. Anna Rodriguez, visited July 22, 2003. Seeking treatment for persistent nightmares. Michael Foster, visited October 11, 2015. Diagnosis: severe depression following divorce. Jennifer Walsh, visited March 7, 2018. Struggling with addiction and suicidal ideation. These weren't historical records. Someone had been documenting visitors to the abandoned building. People who had no business being there. People who shouldn't have been able to get inside. "We need to leave," Janet said quietly. "Right now." But as we turned to go, I noticed something that made me stop. In the corner of the room, in handwriting that looked disturbingly familiar, was a fresh entry. Dr. Elizabeth Peterson, visited November 14, 2019, conducting psychological assessment, seeking answers to questions she doesn't yet know how to ask. That was my name. That was today's date, and that was my handwriting. I had no memory of writing those words. "Janet," I said slowly, "I need you to go back to the main building and call the police. Tell them we may have squatters or trespassers on the property. I'm not leaving you here alone. Yes, you are. Something is very wrong in this place, and I need to document it before we contaminate the scene any further." Janet argued, but eventually agreed to go get help. I waited until I could no longer hear her footsteps. Then I did something that probably wasn't wise. I decided to explore the wing more thoroughly. I moved from room to room, photographing the writing on the walls, trying to piece together the story of what had happened here. The entries from the 1940s through 1970s seemed to be straightforward patient records, probably written by staff members who wanted to remember the people in their care. But starting in the 1980s, the entries changed. They became more personal, more emotional. I can still hear Mrs. Patterson calling for her son. She died in 1967, but sometimes at night you can hear her voice echoing through the halls. The garden blooms for them. No matter how many times they try to let it go wild, it always comes back perfect and beautiful, like it's waiting for someone to return. They're still here. The patients, the staff, everyone who died in this place. They're waiting for someone to remember them properly, to tell their stories. As I read, I began to understand. The garden wing hadn't just been closed in 1999. It had been the site of a tragedy. In 1974, a fire had broken out during the night shift and 17 patients and 3 staff members had died. The wing had been rebuilt and reopened, but it was never the same. Staff reported strange occurrences. Patients claimed to see people who weren't there, and eventually in the 1990s, the decision was made to close the wing permanently, but someone kept coming back. Someone had been maintaining the garden, documenting the history, keeping the memory alive, and now I was here, adding my own story to the walls. I found myself in room 23, which had apparently belonged to a patient named Dorothy Mills. The writing here was different. Not records, but what looked like diary entries written in a shaky elderly hand. Day 1247. The roses are blooming again. Red ones this time, like drops of blood on green silk. I asked Nurse Patricia why they keep blooming when no one tends them, but she just smiles and tells me I'm imagining things. Day 1, 2:48. I'm not imagining anything. Last night I saw them in the garden. The ones who died in the fire. They were walking among the flowers, touching them, whispering to them. Mrs. Patterson was there and young Timothy, who used to sit by my window. They looked peaceful. Aba 2:49, I understand now. The garden doesn't bloom for the living. It blooms for them. For all of us who will never leave this place. It's beautiful, really. A mercy I hadn't expected. The entries went on for months, chronicling Dorothy's growing awareness that she was dying, and her acceptance of what would happen to her after death. The final entry was dated March 15, 1978. They're calling to me from the garden. It's time to join them. I'm not afraid anymore. The flowers will remember us all. I looked out the window at the courtyard garden, and for the first time since entering the wing I really saw it. It wasn't just well maintained. It was alive in a way that seemed impossible. The colors were too vibrant, the growth too perfect. The entire space pulsing with an energy that made my eyes water if I looked too long. And there were people in the garden. At first, I thought they were gardeners, people hired to maintain the space despite what Janet had told me. But as I watched, I realized they were dressed in clothing from different eras. Hospital gowns from the 1950s, staff uniforms from the 1960s, patient clothes from the 1970s. They moved among the flowers with purpose, tending them, whispering to them, occasionally looking up at the windows where I stood. One of them, a woman in a faded blue dress, noticed me watching and waved. Her smile was kind, maternal, and something about her expression made me feel inexplicably sad. I needed to document this. I pulled out my phone and started recording, but when I played back the video, the garden appeared empty, just flowers swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. That's when I heard the singing. It was coming from the room next door. A soft, melodic voice singing a lullaby I remembered from childhood. I followed the sound and found myself in room 24, which had belonged to someone named Catherine Rose. The singing was coming from a woman sitting in the corner chair, rocking back and forth as if she was holding a baby. She was translucent. More suggestion than substance, but I could see her clearly enough to make out her features. She was young, maybe early 20s, with long brown hair and wearing a white hospital gown. She looked up when I entered and smiled. "Oh, hello, dear. I was just singing to my baby. Would you like to hear?" I should have been terrified. Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to run. But there was something so gentle about her, so peaceful, that I found myself nodding. "Rock-a-bye, baby, in the treetop," she sang, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, cradle and all." As she sang, I could see other figures beginning to appear throughout the room. An elderly man standing by the window, a middle-aged woman sitting on the bed, a young boy playing with invisible toys on the floor, all of them translucent, all of them peaceful, all of them looking at me with curious, kind expressions. "You're the counselor," the singing woman said when she finished the lullaby. "You're here to help people heal from their trauma." "Yes," I managed to say. "I'm Dr. Peterson. We've been waiting for someone like you," she continued. "Someone who understands pain, who knows how to help people carry their burdens. We've been carrying ours for so long." The elderly man by the window turned to face me. "We died here," he said simply. "Not all at once, not all in the fire. Some of us died of loneliness, some of despair, some just of old age. But we all died here, and our pain, it soaked into the walls, into the floors, into the very foundation of this place. We're trapped, added the woman on the bed. Not by chains or locks, but by the weight of suffering that was never acknowledged, never properly mourned. The staff meant well, but they were overwhelmed. They didn't have time to really see us to understand what we needed. I began to understand why I was really here. This wasn't about assessing the space for new residents. This was about completing the work that had been started decades ago. The work of helping traumatized souls find peace. "What do you need from me?" I asked. Catherine Rose, still rocking her invisible baby, smiled. "Tell our stories. Help people remember that we were more than just our diagnoses, more than just problems to be managed. We had lives before we came here, dreams that mattered, love that was real." Over the next several hours they told me their stories, real stories, not just the clinical summaries I'd found on the walls. Catherine had been a young mother whose baby had died of influenza, and her grief had been so profound that her family had her committed for melancholia. The elderly man, whose name was George, had been a World War I veteran whose nightmares and flashbacks hadn't been understood as what we now know as PTSD. The woman on the bed, Maria, had been committed by her husband simply for expressing opinions he considered inappropriate for a wife. Each story was unique, but they all shared common threads. People whose pain had been pathologized rather than properly treated, whose humanity had been overlooked in favor of their symptoms, whose deaths had gone largely unmourned because society had already written them off as broken. "The garden remembers us," George explained. "Every flower represents someone who died here, someone whose story matters. The roses for those who died of heartbreak, the lilies for those who died young, the forget-me-nots for those whose names were never spoken after they passed. But maintaining it takes so much energy," Maria added. "We've been holding on for decades, keeping this place alive as a memorial, but we're tired. We need someone to carry the memory forward, someone who can make sure we're not forgotten when we finally let go." I spent the rest of the day listening to their stories, recording everything in my notebook, learning the names and histories of everyone who had appeared to me. By the time Janet returned with the police, I had filled nearly 50 pages with accounts of lives cut short, dreams deferred, and pain that had never been properly acknowledged. The police found no evidence of trespassers, no explanation for the maintained garden, no logical reason for the fresh writing on the walls. They filed a report and left, clearly eager to be done with the place. I convinced Janet to delay the sealing of the wing. I told her I needed more time to complete my assessment, that there were historical and cultural considerations that needed to be addressed. She wasn't happy about it, but she agreed to give me another week. I spent that week researching the histories of everyone I'd encountered. I tracked down death certificates, family records, newspaper obituaries that were often just a few lines long. I compiled a comprehensive record of who they had been before their illnesses, what they had contributed to their communities, who had loved them and mourned them. And then I did something that felt completely right. I organized a memorial service. I contacted local historical societies, genealogy groups, anyone who might have a connection to the people who had died at Willowbrook. To my surprise, I found family members, grandchildren, great-nieces, distant cousins who had never known the full story of what had happened to their relatives. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, about 30 people gathered in the courtyard garden. We read the names of everyone who had died in the garden wing, shared what we knew of their lives, and honored their memory in a way that had never been done properly before. As we spoke, I watched the spirits I'd encountered that first day. They stood among the flowers listening, their faces filled with a peace I hadn't seen before. One by one, as their stories were told and their names were spoken with love and respect, they began to fade, until only Catherine Rose remained. She approached me as the service ended, still rocking her invisible baby, but now there was a lightness about her that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing us, for remembering us properly, for helping our families understand." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we rest," she said, her form already becoming more translucent. "The garden will go wild now, as gardens should when no one tends them. And that's as it should be. Life moves forward. But our stories will live on in the people who heard them today." She looked down at the bundle in her arms, and for just a moment I could see him. A baby boy with his mother's dark hair sleeping peacefully in her embrace. "We're going home," she said. And then they were gone. The garden began to change immediately. The two perfect roses started to droop. The impossibly straight hedges began to grow wild. The swept paths disappeared under fallen leaves. Within a week it looked like any other abandoned space reclaimed by nature and time. But the stories lived on. Several of the family members I'd contacted started researching their own genealogies more deeply, uncovering histories of mental illness, trauma, and resilience that had been hidden for generations. The local historical society created an exhibit about the human cost of outdated mental health treatment. And most importantly, the people who heard those stories carried them forward, ensuring that Catherine Rose and George and Maria and all the others would be remembered not as case studies, but as human beings who had mattered. I submitted my report recommending that the garden wing be preserved as a historical site, rather than sealed off. The state agreed, and it's now part of a larger memorial to patients who died in institutional care during the mid-20th century. Sometimes I go back to visit, to walk through those empty rooms and remember the people I met there. The writing on the walls has faded now, and the rooms feel peaceful in a way they never did when they were filled with unrest. But I carry their stories with me in my work every day. When I sit with clients who feel forgotten, unheard, dismissed by a system that reduces them to symptoms rather than seeing their full humanity, I remember Catherine and George and Maria. I remember that every person's pain matters. Every story deserves to be heard, and every life has value beyond its diagnosis. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons when I'm walking through my own garden at home, I hear the faint echo of a lullaby on the wind, reminding me that some forms of healing can take decades to complete, but that doesn't make them any less important or any less real. That's all for tonight's journey into the dark. These stories find us where we need them most, don't they? When we're alone with our thoughts, drifting between waking and sleep. If you have a story of your own, something that haunts you in the quiet hours, send it to Dark Night. Maybe I'll read it here under the cover of Rain and Shadow. Make sure you're subscribed to Dark Night, and turn on notifications so you never miss when I return with more tales from the places where reality grows thin. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with peace rather than shadows. The rain will keep falling, the stories will keep calling, and I'll be here waiting in the dark.